If you're watching this video the day it's posted, or you took notice of the day it was uploaded, you probably have a certain expectation of what's about to go on. So let me rip the bandage right off. No, this is not the typical April Fool's Day video where I talk about something ridiculous for 15 to 20 minutes before revealing that it's some poorly thought out joke that ultimately only wastes the time of everyone involved. Instead, I'm using this April Fool's Day as an excuse to talk about an extremely weird and out there idea in a completely serious, if a bit more comedic than normal way. If y'all like this kind of thing, maybe we can make a tradition out of it because, in my opinion, this is a much more fun and creative way to use the holiday than the normal YouTuber thing of uploading an obviously fake I'm quitting video for the easy clickbait views. But let's be real, it's not like people were waiting to do that anyways. Sorry for the double intro, I just want to get that out of the way ASAP. Now on to the actual video. Yes, you read that title and thumbnail right, and no, this isn't some weird out-of-season April Fool's joke or brazen clickbait. I genuinely believe that DBD would be a much better game if it were to take some notes from Pokemon. Of all things. Now let's get one thing clear, I'm not suggesting something dumb like giving Trapper a Pikachu, despite the two being a match made in hell for mascots that are absolute garbage in their own games. Nor is this some weird way of clickbaiting the idea of perks being limited to certain survivors like it is in TCM or anything like that. Okay, enough about what I'm not saying, let's focus on what I am trying to say. If you haven't paid attention to Pokemon in the past decade or so, but loved it as a kid, I'd recommend you take a seat for this one. Competitive Pokemon exists. I don't mean competitive Pokemon like battling other kids on the playground until that one asshole with an action replay shows up. I mean spending 5 hours poring over spreadsheets of different interactions just to get your stats set up for one Pokemon. Competitive Pokemon. I don't know if this forbidden knowledge is affecting you the same way it affected me when I first learned about it, because I was like, huh, you're not joking? Okay, cool, I guess. And then I went about my day not really thinking about it until later that night, and it kind of hit me something like this. I don't know if I felt this way because the last I'd ever heard of Pokemon was in middle school when like X and Y came out or something, I don't know. But it definitely surprised me once I had time to actually realize what that meant. And then imagine my shock when I got into looking into it with one of my friends who turned out to be a really big fan of it, and found out it may have the best way of handling a vast array of wildly different powered things in a competitive setting that I've ever seen. Well, at least on one half of it, it did. To make this explanation really quick, competitive Pokemon is currently split up into two parts which are on wildly different sides of the well-thought-out ranked system spectrum. One part, called VGC, uses the actual games as its base medium and is run by Nintendo themselves, but is horrifically grindy, and it's also debatably pay to win. The other half, called Singles, uses a third-party battle simulator run by a group called Smogon instead, and is basically VGC without all the grinding and strange rules or pay to win. We're going to be focusing on the latter because it has what is the inspiration for this video. One more thing, before we get too far into this video, I want to be very clear about what this video is about. This video focuses around the central idea of a ranked mode coming to DBD. I know them some fighting words for some of you, but you should know that this isn't a video about if DBD should get a ranked mode, as that's a whole different discussion we can have another day. This is about if a ranked mode has to come to DBD, this is how I think it should be done. Even if you don't agree with the idea of a DBD ranked mode, I think it's important to discuss how a ranked mode should work, that way if it has to be done and added to the game, it can be done right. When you go to create a team on this battle simulator known as Pokemon Showdown, you're granted with this scrolling tier list of Pokemon. For what is most likely the first time in over 2 years for you, this list of Pokemon you're looking at isn't someone's smash or pass ratings, but instead a list of all available Pokemon as they fall into a system known as the usage tier system. This system contains numerous tiers, and for time's sake, we're only going to be touching on some of the more important and interesting ones. First up is Ubers, which is essentially the Pokemon world's Olympus, as it's an exclusive club filled with nothing but gods, super soldiers, and a dog with a sharp stick. Below Ubers is OU, aka Overused, which is the main competitive tier and a great place to wonder when you got so old and what everything is. OU is followed by UU, standing for Underused, which is essentially the lightweight class in wrestling if half the wrestlers were made out of sand. And finally PU, which is the worst tier and also the only tier that you have a chance of actually knowing what more than 10% of the Pokemon are. An easy way to visualize this tier system is to imagine a bunch of nets aligned in a vertical line, with each net having increasingly smaller holes. Now pour a bunch of rocks onto the nets and let them sift through. The further down the net, the smaller and weaker the rocks it catches are. After pouring the rocks through the nets, should one choose to, they could easily push a rock back up through the nets without damaging them. However, you can't force the same rock further down the net stack without tearing or changing the net. This isn't a perfect analogy, but I hope that makes sense because otherwise this video might get a little hard to understand pretty quickly. Now, that's great and all, but what does this have to do with Dead by Daylight? Nothing. At least not yet. I promise that wasn't a waste of your time, because while most tier lists are created by either bored teens or 30-year-olds desperate for the money to pay off some bad crypto investments, this tier system is sorted by cold, hard numbers. With only a few cases as exceptions, every Pokemon in it is in its tier for one reason: usage rates. The core idea is that instead of trying to force all 1,000 Pokemon to compete for viability in one competitive meta, the community cut up competitive play into the aforementioned tiers so that way balancing isn't really that big of a deal. In this system, if a Pokemon gets waffle stomped in OU, it will eventually drift down to a lower tier where it can hold its own. What's good but not overpowered in a tier stays in that tier, while the rest fall to the tier below it so they can fight for the scraps. This strange and honestly really hard to initially understand system creates what I'd like to call family-friendly Darwinism, and I think this would be the basis for an ideal competitive mode for DBD, with a few changes obviously. While it's no 1,000 Pokemon, at the time of recording, DBD has a total pool of 243 perks and 33 different killers, all of which are wildly diverse in their power ranges, ranging from why would you put yourself through this, to why would you put them through this. This already bloated perk pool is only going to grow from here on out, so implementing a system like the usage tier system is only going to become more and more necessary. The system I'm proposing in this video works as follows. In Ranked, all perks and killers are divided into tiers using data collected from the months leading up to its implementation. For perks, there would be a drop-down in the perk selection that would let you sort by what is acceptable for that tier, and obviously a show all option. Additionally, at the bottom of each perk, its current tier would be shown. For each killer, underneath their difficulty rating on the killer selection screen, their current tier would be shown, and there would probably be a way of sorting by tier. As an example of how this new system would work, let's just play pretend for a second. You log on, and after much deliberation about how much you hate survivors, you decide to play some Nurse with some strong perks and add-ons, and once you hit play, a pop-up appears asking you to select what tier you want to queue for. Due to playing Nurse, the strongest killer in the game, almost objectively, you'll be locked into the highest tier so that survivors will, ideally, be running a build of similar to equal strength of yours and be ready to face a killer of that magnitude. Now, let's say after waffle stomping those poor survivors, you've decided to feel a little guilty and play a little bit of Thirst Trapper to atone for your sins. Due to your killer's low kill rate, you'll be recommended into the lowest tier. However, should you desire to hate yourself, you can still queue into any of the higher tiers. Along with killer restrictions, each tier would also have some perk and maybe add-on restrictions. So in low tiers, you may have to run something like Impression instead of Jolt, and so on and so forth. It's important to remember that while you can't use perks and killers from tiers higher than whichever you're currently queued for, you can still use perks and killers from lower tiers. If you want to run around and stun nurses and spirits out of their powers with flashbangs, while Can You Feel My Heart slowed and reverb mix plays in the background, you absolutely can. However, you can't run Alk Ring, Speed Blight, and stomp on unknowing survivors who only have a Pebble and Tier 1 Spine Chill to their name. Since every player would be able to select a tier before playing this gives all players a bit more control over what they face up against and may alleviate the current little bit... the current DC problem. At this point, I think we've all played a game where half your team DCs once they learn it's a Nurse, Blight, or Spirit. While this definitely isn't a golden pill to cure the problem, it could definitely have a positive impact on this issue, and I think that's worth noting. Adding a system like this wouldn't just benefit players. This system would relieve a lot of stress from the developers, as most new perks would no longer have to compete with the likes of Sprint Burst, Hyper Focus, Off the Record, and MFT to find a usage case. This would also give new life to replica perks that achieve almost exactly the same things as already existing perks, but worse. These replica perks would fill pretty much the same niche as the good perk, but in a different tier. For my DBD players, think about how Desperate Measures is almost always a worse botany knowledge when it comes to healing, and for any Pokemon players who are still somehow on this far into the video, think of Tyranitar and Hippowdon as sand setters. While in both games, one option is almost universally better than the other, the weaker option still finds usage due to tier limitations, and this system, underrated and outshone perks like Will Make It, will finally be able to find a common usage case, which I'm sure Will Make It will especially enjoy seeing as it's been blue-balled from being meta about 4 times now. This system would also create a more dynamic series of metas. One change to a perk could potentially affect all different metas, especially if the perk usage rates are adjusted on a semi-regular basis, like maybe twice every chapter or so. This can happen in a lot of different ways, but one example is if a perk gets really heavily used in a tier higher than its current one, it will get moved up to the higher tier, leaving a hole in the meta for the tier that it left, which may lead to a new perk filling its job in the old tier, leaving yet another hole in the tier that the second perk left, and so on and so forth. That's not really making sense, but trust me, it makes sense when you actually see it, okay? I swear I'm not going insane. Inversely, if a perk or killer starts falling behind in their tier, they may get moved down a tier in a tier update, thus changing the meta of the tier it enters and potentially the ones below whatever tier it ends up entering. This ideally would prevent another dead hard situation where one perk is meta for several years, which is something I think we would all like to avoid at almost any cost. A final additional perk-centric benefit of this tiering system is that it would most likely lead to a segmented perk selection menu, as perks would be sorted by the highest tier they're available in. Meaning that instead of frantically searching for that one perk while you have 5 seconds left and panic picking something only for that post-panic clarity to sink in and realize you're now running Technician, as long as you know what tier the perk is in, you could easily sort out the other tiers, greatly reducing the amount of bloat that you need to sort through the perk pool. And with us now having the search bar, this isn't as important, but I think it will be very helpful to beginners, but we'll come back to that in a second. I know this system isn't a perfect fit and will need some decent changes from how it worked in Pokemon to fit DBD, like swapping usage rates for kill or escape rates, or maybe even average chase duration, or some other metric, because I don't know if usage rates will perfectly work in DBD because of the differences between using a Pokemon and using a perk that just buffs you, but we'll have to see. There will also maybe be one or two that have to be locked to a certain tier, regardless of win rate, like Windows of Opportunity being locked to the lowest tier, despite its really high usage and win rate, because of its importance as a learning tool to both new and intermediate players, and also players who've been playing for a long time and still aren't good. And I know you also probably have some concerns about the negative side effects of a system like this, so let me first try and address them. First, wouldn't top-tier killers like Nurse have almost impossibly long queue times? In simple terms, yes. But actually, no. While there most likely would be a slight increase in queue times for these killers, I don't think it would be as drastic as one would assume. In DBD, the top dog is undoubtedly the Nurse, a eugenics-obsessed psychopath that ignores the core mechanic of the game unless it suits her. On the other hand, last year, Pokemon's top dog was, well, a dog. With a pokey stick. This rather unassuming critter from the opening does the exact same thing as the Nurse does. However, instead of ignoring looping, he ignores the type chart. Until it suits him. Both of these characters completely break apart their respective games' balance to the point where unless you are literally unable to play them, not picking either of them is willingly putting yourself at a major competitive disadvantage for whatever game you are playing. As such, they are both incredibly popular and oppressive in their respective games. Even though Zacian arguably ruined the tier, Ubers was still one of the most popular Pokemon tiers to play. There's a lot of reasons from this that can range from crutching on the strongest OP stuff in the game to just wanting to use this funky little monkey fella, or even a desire to prove yourself against the harshest conditions possible. Unfortunately, DBD has a significant lack of funky monkeys. However, there's no shortage of players who rely on strong crutches to make up for skill and or deep-rooted competitive spirit, so I think 2 out of the big 3 isn't half bad. We could also throw in some extra blood points for playing on less populated tiers as well, since blood points seem to magically fix every problem this game has ever had. Isn't that right, behavior? For the love of God, stop giving out blood points to try and fix things. Whew. Sorry about that. Anyways, another big complaint I could see about the system is that it divides the queues up and splits the player base. This is the biggest complaint when it comes to discussing any form of ranked mode in DBD, and I can understand why. Way back when, queues for a DBD match could easily be anywhere from 20 to 60 minutes, and I think that long-time players are worried about getting those queue times. While this is understandable, the reality of the matter is DBD is leaps and bounds more popular than it was back then, meaning it has a much larger average player base. Personally, I believe DBD's player base is large enough for it to be split into a few sections. Should it be split as Pokemon? Absolutely not, no. Showdown is split into somewhere around like 84 separate modes at one point when I counted while researching this video, and that's, that's all tiers across all generations and a couple weird side modes and limited time events or something. I don't fully understand the website, it's too complicated, just put me in random battles, please. Anyways, despite being so split up, in most of the regular modes you'll find a match in less than 30 seconds, even though the website has a fraction of DBD's average player base. Personally, I'd like to see a 3-tier system for DBD that goes somewhere along the lines of OP Sweatfest, normal players, and... oh, I forgot you even existed. But in the future, a 4th tier may become necessary. And once again, I think DBD could easily handle having its player base split up somewhat evenly among these 4 or 5 different modes, including a casual one, of course. There could also be just put me in the game already button, where it'll queue you for any tier that your build allows, meaning that you can just get in the game quickly if you're just trying to grind some blood points, tomes, finish the rift in 16 hours because you had a massive burnout of the game. Let's be honest, we've all been there. I've done that a couple times. Another big problem with this, and this is the biggest problem, and there is no argument about this, coding this into the spaghetti jungle that is DBD would be almost impossible. This system would require an enormous amount of time and effort to create. That's an indisputable fact. Now, whether or not Behavior would be willing to put in that much effort to something that isn't a Trickster or Fang skin is completely up for debate. One of the people that I sent the script to before recording mentioned that this process could also complicate the new player onboarding process, and this is a completely valid concern. But I would argue the exact opposite, especially in the future when the game gets even bigger. Each killer has tons of interactions on every map with different perks, with different tiles, even just random environments, like that one bush that constantly screws over Bubba even though he's 5 feet away on Garden of Joy. You know the bush, you know the one I'm talking about. As a new player, it's considering how long Dead by Daylight's been going and how good some of the top players are, it can be really intimidating to get into the game. But I think breaking it into separate sections so that way they can learn it piece by piece would do wonders for the new player onboarding. And this is only going to become more pronounced as more content gets added with every chapter, because that's more that these players would have to learn. So recommending these players to play like the lowest tier to learn the game, the basics of the game, and then some of the perks, and then working their way up would drastically reduce how much they need to learn, and also help reduce the grind of getting into the game. Since now they don't have to choose between all the killers, they can just unlock the killers that are in the tier that they're currently playing, learn those, same with the survivors and the perks, and then once they're bored of the tier, they move up to the next one and start the process all over again. I know this is a really out there idea, and also the script's kind of all over the place, but I hope at the very minimum you can see where I'm coming from. The DBD community as a whole is really split on the idea of a ranked mode, so I figured I'd throw my 2 cents on how it should be done if it has to come to the game, and into the deep, soulless void that is modern YouTube, and see what comes back. Have I convinced you? Do you think I'm a rambling lunatic? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear it either way. Anyways, with all that said, happy hunting.